A racist man disrespected Lucille O'Neal at her own retirement. Thought he'd get the last word. But what he forgot? Lucille raised Big Shaq. And when Big Shaq knocks, it's not just a visit, it's a verdict. This wasn't revenge. This was legacy with footsteps. And that door, it didn't just open, it answered for every silence Lucille ever endured. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun rose over Elmsworth, Georgia, with the kind of soft gold that paints the streets like memory. On Maple Hill, where the town's oldest community center stood, all bricks, ivy, and stories, a gathering buzzed with celebration. It was a day for Lucille O'Neal. After 40 years as the town's librarian, advocate, and quiet revolution in heels, she was retiring. The folding chairs were lined in neat rows, some creaking beneath weight, some left empty by ghosts who would have been proud to see this day. There were balloons, red velvet cake with buttercream letters, and a crowd full of people who owed her something, a book recommendation, a second chance, a life lesson whispered between aisles. Shaquille O'Neal stood near the back, towering, but trying not to be the center of attention. He'd flown in under the radar, no fanfare, no entourage, just family. This wasn't about him. This was Lucille's moment. Dressed in a powder blue suit that caught the light just enough to soften his size, he watched his mother take the podium, her hands steady, her smile wide but seasoned. Lucille's voice carried like it always had, warm, deliberate, no rush to impress. "I never needed a pulpit," she began, "just a bookshelf and the courage to tell young people the truth about who they are." The crowd clapped, but she waved them down gently. "Always more teacher than preacher. This place taught me more than I taught anyone. I came here at 22 scared and stubborn, and now I leave full, because you let me serve." Laughter rolled through the room when she recounted a story about chasing a group of kids out of the encyclopedia section when they tried to start a secret card club. The names had changed, the faces aged, but the heart of the town still pulsed through her stories. Shaq smiled, hands clasped, thinking of how many times his mother had made a room feel like a home just by showing up. Then it happened. The drop, like a record scratching in the middle of a love song. Near the center of the crowd, standing with the poise of someone who believed he belonged everywhere, was Randall Knox, a man with slicked-back silver hair, an expensive beige blazer, and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. He raised a glass, sweet tea likely, and called out, not loudly, but enough for the people around him to hear, "To the woman who taught our colored children how to dream beyond their station." It was said with that poisonous politeness, the kind that wears manners like a mask, the kind designed to cut deeper because it knows it can. Silence fell like a hush from the heavens. Someone near him chuckled awkwardly, unsure if it was a joke or a jab. Someone else muttered, "Jesus, Randall." Lucille didn't flinch. She held her gaze, not on him, but beyond him. For a half-second the corners of her mouth tightened, just barely. Then she resumed her speech as if he'd said nothing at all. But Shaq saw it. He saw everything. The moment the sun lied, casting warmth over a room suddenly gone cold. The ceremony resumed, but something had cracked. The music played, the cake was served, and neighbors offered Lucille hugs, laced with admiration. But no one looked directly at Randall. No one called him out either. He lingered for a while, sipping his tea like the king of a kingdom no one voted for, then vanished quietly, before the event ended. Shaq stayed by his mother's side the rest of the afternoon, answering polite questions from townsfolk, and posing for photos he didn't really want to take. But every time he caught Lucille's profile in the sunlight, he saw the weight she carried behind her poise. Not the kind of weight age brings, the kind racism leaves, subtle, cumulative, always collecting interest. Later that evening, as the sky darkened and the last of the folding chairs were stacked, Lucille sat quietly in the empty hall, hands in her lap, staring at nothing in particular. Shaq sat beside her, not saying anything. They didn't need words. They'd grown up in a world where silence often spoke the loudest. "You okay?" he finally asked. Lucille nodded, her voice a near whisper. "I'm just remembering." She didn't elaborate, and Shaq didn't push. But deep down, something had shifted. This wasn't just about a man saying something ugly in public. It was about a wound reopened. A battle that wasn't finished. A threat, cloaked in civility, thrown like a stone through the window of her peace. And though she'd faced worse, though she'd stood stronger than men, twice her size. Shaq saw something new in her that night. Not fear, exactly, but a quiet fatigue, as if the final page of her story had been smudged with something she'd spent a lifetime trying to erase. The next morning, Lucille was back to her usual self, making breakfast, folding laundry, smiling with her eyes again. But Shaq watched her differently now, watched how she winced when bending to pick up a dropped spoon, how she paused a beat too long before answering the phone, how her eyes wandered out the window more often, as if waiting for something, or someone to show up uninvited. He remembered Randall's face, not the words, the face, that smug tilt of the chin, that quiet pride in thinking he'd done something brave by saying something cruel. Shaq knew men like that. Men who wielded their prejudice like privilege. Men who thought history owed them a soft seat and a loud voice. And though Lucille said nothing of it again, Shaq felt it. This story wasn't over. Something had been set in motion. And even the sun, warm as it had been that day, had betrayed them, lighting a moment it should have shadowed. Because not all violence comes with fists. Some comes dressed in smiles, served in tea, spoken just loud enough for the heart to hear. And when the sun lies once, you start looking at it different forever. There's a kind of rot that doesn't smell, doesn't show. It spreads beneath polished floors and silk-tied necks, smiles wide for photos, and shakes hands with conviction. Randall Knox was born from that rot. Not the kind you notice in a man's voice or clothes. No, Randall had charm. The kind that didn't flinch when addressing a room full of people who weren't like him. The kind that could convince a church board to sell a community lot if the price was just right. But when you really looked past the good hair and cufflinks, you saw it. The smile. Crook, not in shape but in purpose. Like every grin carried a hidden word he wouldn't say out loud. Randall's story began long before he walked into Lucille O'Neal's retirement, and tainted the air with that single sugared slur. Elmsworth remembered the Knox family. How could they not? Randall's grandfather, William Knox, had once been mayor back when the town was still segregated by custom even after the signs came down. He'd made his fortune buying up homes in the Black District during the 1950s, for pennies, through pressure, through laws nobody dared question. People said he had a gift for seeing opportunity where others saw problems. That was their way of saying he knew how to take what wasn't his, and do it with a pen instead of a gun. Randall's father, Chester Knox, followed suit, expanding the family's holdings. Real estate, political favors, silent partners in local banks, always just clean enough not to raise alarms, always just dirty enough to leave a bruise you couldn't. Randall grew up in the big white house on Jefferson Hill, where the gravel driveway wound like a snake, and the chandelier in the foyer glistened even when the town went dark in a summer blackout. From his window he could see half the town, the right side at least. He went to private school, summered in Hilton Head, played golf with city officials by the time he was 19, but he watched his father closely, learned how power moved in whispers. Chester used to say, "A good deal is when they thank you after you take it from them." Randall never forgot that. He made it his code. By the time Lucille O'Neal stood in his way, Randall had already established himself as the man to know if you wanted to make things happen quietly. He didn't run for office like his grandfather. Randall didn't need votes. He had influence, and that never expired. A few years back, he'd proposed a redevelopment plan for the land surrounding the historic Brookdale community, a place mostly home to elderly black families, some who'd lived there since Reconstruction. He called it revitalization, but to Lucille it was just another eviction in disguise. At that time, Lucille sat on the city's Cultural Preservation Committee, not because she wanted to, but because no one else would hold the line. She reviewed his proposal, studied the maps, the rezoning requests, and quietly brought in legal help from a nonprofit out of Atlanta. What happened next made local headlines, though names were kept out to avoid scandal. Randall's deal was denied by the city council, after a surprise petition and historical site appeal landed on the mayor's desk. It was all legal, all procedural, but to Randall, it was personal. He never confronted her directly. He didn't need to. He withdrew for a while, poured his efforts into a new development across the county line, and made sure to smile every time he saw Lucille at charity events or fundraisers. But that smile, that crooked, cold smile, told her everything. He hadn't forgotten. Men like him never do. Now, years later, he'd returned to the center of attention, not to celebrate her, but to quietly remind everyone in the room of their place, and his. That one sentence at her retirement, was no slip of the tongue. It was a scalpel. One precise, rehearsed incision, meant to bleed old wounds. What most didn't know, what only a few in the deepest corners of city history could recall, was that Randall's family hadn't just profited from the suffering of others. They had rewritten town memory. Documents disappeared. Deeds were lost. Entire blocks where black-owned businesses once stood had been turned into corporate offices, their original owners now long gone, or buried beneath gravel parking lots. Randall wasn't preserving legacy. He was continuing erasure, and Lucille had been one of the few people with enough backbone, memory, and quiet resources to push back. So when Randall walked into that retirement celebration, he wasn't there out of curiosity or coincidence. He came because the spotlight was on her, and that didn't sit right with him. Men like Randall don't mind powerful black women, as long as they stay grateful and quiet. Lucille, bless her bones, had never been either. After the ceremony, Randall returned to his home on Hollow Bend, a sprawling modern farmhouse on top of land that once belonged to a freedman's family in the 80s. It was the kind of place magazines would call rustic elegance, all reclaimed wood and stone fireplaces, designed to look humble while hiding how much money built it. He poured himself a bourbon, stirred in 2 ice cubes, and sat alone on his patio, overlooking acres of land he pretended to care about. He wasn't worried. Not yet. In his mind, Lucille was a retired woman with nothing but a few speeches left in her. As for Shaq, he hadn't seen the man in years, and barely regarded him as anything more than a local legend with money and charm. Randall didn't understand what kind of son Lucille had raised, but he would. In that moment, Randall believed he had reasserted his place, disrupted Lucille's story just enough to stain the ending. That was how he worked. Not with fire, not with fists, but with discomfort, with unchallenged words that hung in the air like smoke, hard to trace but harder to forget. The man with the crooked smile wasn't interested in forgiveness or understanding. He was interested in control and reminders. But the thing about men like Randall is that they underestimate silence. They think silence is surrender. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that Lucille's silence that day wasn't weakness. It was strategy. A pause before the next move. And Shaq, well, he wasn't his father's son. He was his mother's. Raised not just in strength, but in restraint, in remembering. While Randall slept soundly in his antique bed, a quiet storm had already begun to gather. Not with shouting, not with lawsuits, but with awareness, a reckoning that didn't wear a name tag or knock with fists. It whispered, it watched, and it waited. Because sometimes, the smile that tries to undo you is the same one that exposes a man's deepest fear, that his time is running out, and the people he once silenced have learned how to speak without needing permission. The morning after the ceremony, Lucille moved through her house like someone trying not to wake a ghost. She woke up before dawn. She always did, slipping on her housecoat, wrapping her curls in a silk scarf, and making her way to the kitchen. It wasn't the kind of morning where you checked the weather or turned on the TV. It was the kind where you waited for the kettle to whistle and listened to what the quiet was trying to tell you. Shaquille was still upstairs. He'd flown in for the weekend and hadn't said much after they'd gotten home. He'd offered to carry the leftover food inside, made a few jokes about the potato salad disappearing too fast, and then went silent when she said she was tired. He'd hugged her gently and kissed the top of her head. She hadn't looked him in the eye. That was the thing about Lucille. You could sit across from her and talk for hours, but it was her eyes that spoke the truth. And this morning, they carried something unfamiliar. Not just tiredness, but a kind of hesitation, like she was replaying something in her head that hadn't settled right. And though she wouldn't say it out loud, her hands told the story, wiping the counter twice, folding the same napkin again, stirring sugar into her tea long after it had dissolved. She didn't mention Randall. Not once. Not his name. Not his words. Not that ugly grin. But in the stillness of that kitchen, in the precise way she poured hot water, like a ritual, it hung in the air, not the event, but the echo of it. Like a song she didn't choose to remember but couldn't unhear. Lucille had been through worse. That's what everyone would say. They'd point to her work in the civil rights archives, her leadership during the public school integration protests, the time she was followed home for testifying against a corrupt zoning board. They'd say she was tough, resilient, built from brick and baptized in pressure. And they'd be right. But what they didn't see was what it took after each of those moments. The recovery, the quiet grieving, the reset. And this time, Something was different. Not more dangerous, maybe, but heavier. It wasn't the first time a white man had tried to reduce her with his words. But it was the first time she'd felt it sink so low. So quick, like it didn't even surprise her anymore. Like she expected it. That was the part that hurt most. Not the insult, but the resignation that came with it. She found herself looking out the window more often that day, watching the neighborhood like it might shift shape. The kids across the street were walking to the bus stop, laughing about something that didn't matter yet. The mail truck rattled by, and the neighbor's dog barked on cue. Everything looked the same. But inside, something had been dislodged. In the corner of the living room sat her retirement gifts. Books, photo albums, plaques. Shaq had brought in a giant frame with pictures of her library days. And someone had written legacy in gold cursive across the matting. It should have made her smile. It didn't. Lucille moved toward the bookshelf, her fingers trailing along spines she knew by heart. Baldwin, Hurston, Du Bois, each one a weight she had carried and passed down. She touched a worn copy of The Fire Next Time, opened it halfway, and found the note she'd written years ago to herself. Keep telling the truth, even if your voice trembles. She closed it softly. There was a mirror in the hallway, just past the coat rack, angled in such a way that you couldn't look into it by accident. Lucille stood in front of it now. Not out of vanity, out of curiosity. What did the world see when it looked at her now? A retired librarian? A grandmother? A woman whose fight was over? She stared. Her face looked familiar, but the eyes didn't. They were watchful, even of herself. She heard Shaq's footsteps above, slow, deliberate, the kind of walk you have when you're thinking too much. She wasn't ready to talk to him. She wasn't sure what she'd even say, because once you start describing a wound, it becomes real in a way that silence can't protect anymore. By lunchtime, she was back in her chair, knitting something she didn't plan to finish. The television was on, but the volume low. Some talk show mumbling about elections and morning drama. She wasn't listening. Her mind kept circling back to the moment Randall raised his glass. The word station lingered like a bruise. The assumption that they were always meant to stay in one place. Lucille didn't cry. That wasn't her way, but she did feel her throat catch when she thought of how easy it was for that man to tarnish a moment she'd waited decades for. How he'd spoken it like a compliment. How some people in the room had laughed. When Shaq finally came down, he didn't say much, just poured himself a glass of orange juice and leaned against the counter. "You sleep okay?" he asked. Lucille nodded without looking up. "Fine." She lied. He knew it. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, unfolding the newspaper like he wasn't watching her from the corner of his eye. The air between them felt delicate, not tense, but suspended, like a bridge waiting for the first footstep. "Everything feel different this morning?" he asked. Lucille met his eyes then. For the first time all day. "Just feels quiet."
That was all she said. But in her voice, Shaq heard it. The shift, the ache, the need to process something too deep for surface talk.
He respected that. He didn't push, but he watched. Because no matter how composed his mother was, he could always tell when something inside her had changed. The woman who taught him to read by candlelight during a blackout, who once kept her cool while a neighbor called the police on her for walking suspiciously near her own home. She had a fire that didn't dim easily. But today, it flickered. And Shaq, for all his strength and presence, felt powerless. Because there was nothing to punch, no court to dominate, no mic to drop. There was just this, a silent injustice, spoken softly but meant to wound deeply, and a mother who would rather hold it than hand it over. That evening, Lucille lit a candle in the window, a habit she'd picked up from her grandmother, a symbol of presence, of memory, of resilience. Not for religion, for remembrance. The light stayed on all night. Even after she went to bed. Even after Shaq turned out the rest of the lights. Because some days all you can do is let the flame speak where words would fall short. And when a mother's eyes shift, even slightly, you don't question her pain. You listen to it. You guard, because her silence is not surrender.
It's strategy.
Shaq had always known when something was off with his mother. It wasn't about what she said. Lucille O'Neal could paint calm across a battlefield. It was about the way she moved. How long she lingered in doorways. The way she stirred her coffee just a little too long. And that Sunday afternoon, sitting in her kitchen, he saw it again. That invisible shift. Something tightened in the room, even though her lips still smiled when she asked if he wanted more sweet tea. He didn't ask about the retirement ceremony directly. He'd replayed Randall's words in his head enough times already, heard the shift in the room, saw the way Lucille never flinched. But it was the after that haunted him, the quiet she'd wrapped around herself like armor. Shaq had grown up recognizing the signs. Not from her alone, but from every black woman who'd survived long enough to be called strong like it was a compliment. That strength always came with a cost. It always masked something. He drove into town later that afternoon, claiming he needed to pick up something for dinner. Lucille offered to write him a list, but he waved it off. Truth was, he didn't need groceries. He needed to move, to think, to trace whatever gut feeling had been keeping his shoulders tight since the ceremony. Elmsworth was still Elmsworth. Tidy, proud, slow to change, but it had tells if you looked closely. A paint scratch here, a crooked mailbox there. Shaq wasn't new to subtle signals. He started at the community center. The decorations were down, the event banners gone, but the staff inside looked on edge. Miss Risa, who had known Lucille since the early library days, barely made eye contact when he walked in. "Everything all right around here?" he asked, voice low but pointed. She nodded too quickly. "Fine, Mr. O'Neal. Just fine." That was a lie. The kind you tell when you're protecting someone who's always protected you. He pressed gently. "Anyone been bothering y'all since the event?" Her hands twitched before she smoothed them against her skirt. "Nothing major. Someone threw eggs at the back wall a few nights ago. Kids, probably. Happened." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Kids aim for the side, not the staff door." She blinked, gave a half-hearted laugh, then changed the subject. From there, he drove past Hollow Bend. Randall's estate sat like a throne, fences pristine, camera posts glinting in the sun. Too clean, too still. Shaq didn't stop, not yet, but he watched the way the trees bent slightly behind the house, like even nature kept its distance. The next stop was the planning office downtown. He walked in like he owned the place, not out of arrogance but muscle memory. People knew who he was. Sometimes that was a burden. Today it was a key. He asked to see public property records, zoning plans, complaints, transfer notices around the Brookdale area. What he found didn't surprise him, but it did confirm everything he'd feared. 3 homes near the historical district had been purchased quietly over the last 6 months by a shell company out of Charleston. But the business license led back to Mason and Lowe, a firm with long ties to Randall Knox. The pattern was familiar: slow acquisition, quiet pressure, sudden permit changes. It was Randall's playbook. What made Shaq's stomach twist wasn't just the land grabs, it was the subtle weaponization of legality. One of the homeowners had filed a noise complaint weeks ago. The response? A fine for improper fencing. Another reported someone trespassing at night. The result? A code enforcement officer showed up at her door to cite a trash bin left out too long. Harassment, just dressed up in municipal paperwork. Back at Lucille's house, she was pretending to nap. He didn't disturb her. Instead, he walked the perimeter outside. At first, everything looked fine. Then he noticed it, the faintest crack across the bottom of the garage door. A boot scuff near the side window. Too subtle for her to notice, too specific for it to be random. The bruise was invisible, but it was real, and it was spreading. That night, Shaq sat alone on the porch, hands folded, gaze distant. His memories weren't silent either. They came back in pieces, not loud, not sharp, but weighty. He was 8 when a neighbor told him not to play so loud near their hedges. He was 10 when a teacher raised her eyebrows, when he picked Maya Angelou for a book report. He was 12 when his mother held his hand a little too tight while walking past the police station. Each time, Lucille said the same thing, in her soft steel voice: "You walk taller when they try to shrink you." But she never said how much it took to stand that tall every day. He remembered her standing at that town meeting, years ago, when she challenged the council on the Brookdale redevelopment. How her voice stayed calm even as 3 white men tried to talk over her. He remembered her smile afterward, not triumphant, but tired, the kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep. Now, he could feel that same weight, returning. And Randall wasn't just targeting Lucille anymore. He was peeling back the edges of her life, her neighborhood, her center, her peace. It was meant to unravel her quietly, with paperwork and whispers. No need for fists when you can suffocate with silence. Shaq knew he couldn't charge in. This wasn't the court. This wasn't a game. It was slower, uglier. It required precision and patience. The next day, he made a few calls. Not loud ones. Friends in journalism. Contacts in community outreach. He asked quiet questions. He stirred interest where needed. Dropped hints without pointing fingers. Not to expose Randall. Not yet. That would come later. For now it was about understanding the shape of the bruise. How far it stretched, how deep it went. And all the while, he watched Lucille. She cooked like usual, watched the local news, smiled at the mailman. But her laugh was thinner. Her eyes darted more. And sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, her fingers drummed against her knee, a rhythm he hadn't seen in years, the same one she used to tap when she was bracing herself for another fight. Shaq didn't press her. Not yet. But he saw her, and she knew it. The bruise wasn't just hers anymore. It was his too. Hollow Bend wasn't the kind of street you just ended up on. It curled like a snake off the main highway, past the newer subdivisions with their vinyl siding and solar lights, past the last of the gas stations, and into a place that looked like it didn't care whether the world changed or not. The trees here leaned close over the road, their roots deep in soil laced with stories nobody wrote down. And at the end of that bend, hidden behind wrought iron gates and manicured hedges trimmed too clean, stood the house Randall Knox built. Shaq hadn't meant to drive there. Not at first. But after 2 days of quiet calls, cold glances, and whispers about permits and pressure, his feet had moved on their own. He needed to see it, the center of the storm, the stage from which Randall smiled like a man untouchable. It wasn't just a house. It was the house. Built in the 90s but styled like an antebellum tribute, white pillars too wide for their purpose, windows too high for comfort, and a front porch that stretched like a jawline. But it wasn't the aesthetics that made Shaq's chest tight, it was the dirt underneath it. He'd done his research. The estate sat on 5 acres of land that had once belonged to the Mathis and Broader families, 2 black households who had tilled, planted and built there since the late 80s. But in 1964, during a zoning shift pushed by Randall's grandfather, the land was quietly seized, condemned and sold for infrastructure expansion that never came. And now it was marble floors and imported brick. A home that stood like a monument to stolen legacy. Shaq sat in his SUV across the road, not hidden, not trying to be. He watched. Windows were drawn, but not shaded. A light flickered behind the second-story pane. The porch was clean, as if someone wiped it down nightly. Every part of it felt performative. A statement house, not of taste, of dominance. After a few minutes a curtain moved. Barely. But it did. He didn't need a full view to know. Randall was watching back. It was a strange kind of face-off. No threats. No words. Just presence. And sometimes, that was enough to pull tension tighter than anything spoken aloud. Shaq didn't move. He let the engine idle. Let the moment settle like dust. He wondered what Randall saw through those windows. Did he see a man? A problem? Did he remember the boy who used to sit in the library after school while his mother stayed late filing books and fighting off city budget cuts? The standoff didn't last long. Shaq rolled the window down an inch, just enough to let the air in. Hollow Bend smelled different than the rest of Elmsworth. Sterile, filtered, like someone had tried to scrub the history out of it. He thought of Lucille, of how she used to drive past this land, when he was a child, and never look in its direction. He remembered asking once why they never took this road. She hadn't answered, just turned the dial on the radio and said, "Some places ain't meant for passing through." Now he understood. The silence between him and the house was loud. The kind that filled your lungs with something heavier than air. Shaq broke the moment first, turning the key, backing out slowly. He didn't look away until the bend took the house out of view, and even then, he could feel it. That house staring at his back, smug and unmoved. But what Randall didn't understand, what men like him never seemed to, was that Shaq didn't come to intimidate. He came to observe, to measure, to memorize. Because justice wasn't always served in the courthouse or the street. Sometimes it started in silence, in showing up unannounced, in letting a man know, "I see you." Later that night, Shaq sat on the back porch of Lucille's home, drink in hand, stars above. The house on Hollow Bend replayed in his mind. Every angle, every inch. He thought about how people built their empires on bones and expected no one to dig. Thought about how Randall inherited a system and called it tradition. He also thought about timing. Pressure. Strategy. This wasn't a moment for rage. It was a moment for reckoning. Because somewhere inside that fortress of polished history, Randall was wondering if that visit was a warning. And that was enough for now. Let him stew in it. Let him look over his shoulder when the lights flickered. Let him wonder how close the past could creep when it wanted to be remembered. Shaq didn't need to knock. Not yet. Just driving past was enough to start the clock ticking. And in the quiet distance between two men who never spoke a word, a storm had already begun. The truth doesn't always knock on the front door. Sometimes it whispers from old paper, buried in the dust of forgotten files, waiting for someone with the right eyes and the right memory to come look. That's how Shaquille ended up in the city archives 2 days after passing by Hollow Bend. Not because he expected to find anything specific, but because something about the way Randall watched him, that cold stare from behind the curtain, didn't feel like confidence. It felt like fear, and fear, Shaq had learned, always came with a history. The archives building hadn't changed in years. Fluorescent lights buzzing, linoleum floors that echoed too much, and a climate-controlled reading room that smelled like yellowed pages and old coffee. Shaq remembered being here once as a kid, tagging along with Lucille while she researched zoning laws and historical grants. He'd sat quietly, flipping through a children's atlas while she pulled files with surgical focus. She never just fought issues, she documented them, preserved the paper trail because the past had a way of getting rewritten when no one was watching. Now it was his turn to watch. He started broad: Knox family holdings, land transfers, real estate filings from the 60s. It was all there, folded between typed memos and official city letters. But then he noticed a side file, misfiled, maybe, or maybe just overlooked. It had a name he hadn't seen before: Harriet C. Jennings. The letterhead on the document was dated 1968. No land deeds, just correspondence. And inside, tucked in a thin yellowed envelope, was a single-page letter. The signature stopped him cold. Chester H. Knox, Randall's father. Shaq read the letter once, then again slower. It wasn't addressed to the city. It wasn't part of any lawsuit or hearing. It was personal, handwritten in dark blue ink, cursive steady but emotional. Chester had written to Lucille, not formally, not with airs, just Lucille. And what he wrote didn't sound like the man Shaq had heard stories about. This wasn't power talking. This was confession. He said he had once been in love with a woman named Harriet, a black woman from the Brookdale district. He'd met her when he was 19, working as a junior clerk at the recorder's office. They used to talk behind the courthouse. Away from judging eyes, he called her the first person who ever saw him, not the name he carried. But when word got out, his father, William Knox, sent Harriet's family a notice of eviction, disguised as routine rezoning. Within a month, they were gone. Chester never saw her again, and in the letter he admitted he never forgave himself. He'd married a white woman from Virginia 2 years later, built his empire, took over his father's position. But that ghost never left. What broke Shaq wasn't just the hypocrisy. It was the last paragraph. I see her sometimes in women like you, Lucille. Proud, unmovable, kind, but not fragile. And I know if there is any reckoning left for men like me, it begins with asking for forgiveness from those we never had the right to wound. Shaq folded the letter slowly. His hands were steady, but his heart wasn't. He didn't ask why it was here, unfiled and unmarked. Maybe Lucille had donated it quietly to the city archives years ago. Maybe she didn't want the weight of it in her home. Or maybe she left it here because some truths didn't belong in living rooms. They belonged underground, with the rest of the bones. When he brought it back to the desk, the clerk didn't blink, just nodded when Shaq asked for a copy. He took it in silence, the paper now heavier than any trophy he'd ever held. Back at the house, Lucille was pruning her rosebush. Deliberate, careful. Shaq stood by the fence watching her for a while before speaking. You ever know a woman named Harriet Jennings? He asked. Lucille didn't look up, just paused for a beat, then clipped another stem. I did, she said softly. A long time ago. He handed her the letter without another word. She took it, read it once, and didn't flinch. I thought it was gone, she said after a long moment. Shaq leaned against the porch rail. You kept that kind of history to yourself? Lucille folded the letter gently, slid it into the pocket of her apron. Some things ain't for telling, they're for remembering. He wanted to ask more, wanted to know how it felt, carrying the truth of a man who had both harmed and once tried to love across a line he helped draw. But Lucille didn't seem shaken. She seemed settled. "He wasn't a good man," she said finally. "But he wasn't all bad either. And that's what makes it harder, doesn't it?" Shaq nodded slowly. "Randall doesn't know about this, does he?" Lucille's smile didn't reach her eyes. "If he does, he buried it deeper than I ever did." And that's when it struck Shaq, the root of Randall's twisted hatred. It wasn't just inherited racism. It was inherited shame. A legacy not just of dominance, but of buried contradiction. Randall had spent his life defending a name built on silence. And somewhere deep down he knew it. That anger wasn't just pride, it was fear of collapse. Because if even one piece of the story cracked, the whole statue could fall. Later that evening, Shaq sat alone in the living room, the copy of the letter on the table beside him. He imagined Randall as a boy, raised in a house that preached order and legacy, all while the ghosts in the grass whispered other names. He imagined what it might have done to a boy to hear that his father had once loved someone he was taught to despise. How that shame might have hardened into control, into cruelty. The more Shaq considered it, the clearer the picture became. Randall wasn't just protecting a reputation. He was fighting off the truth of who his family really was. And the part of him that hated Lucille, that wasn't just racism, that was fear. That she and women like her remembered the past he was desperate to erase. The lawn outside the Knox estate wasn't just trimmed, it was sterilized. And now Shaq knew why. It wasn't about beauty, it was about control. Randall was afraid of what grew wild, what couldn't be manicured or fenced in. But ghosts don't stay buried forever. Not when you build your empire on their bones. And now Shaq held one of those ghosts in his hand. He wasn't sure yet what he'd do with it. Not exactly, but he knew this. Randall Knox would soon realize that some names haunt not just land but bloodlines. And once the grass starts whispering, you can't unhear it. It had only been 3 weeks since Lucille's retirement, but it felt like the town of Elmsworth had already started to miss her. Her absence left a silence that didn't quite feel right, like a familiar rhythm had gone missing from the streets. The library ran, the community center opened on time, and the bus routes stayed the same. But people noticed. They always do when the person holding the thread steps away. So when the invitation came from the Elmsworth Youth Alliance, a quiet request for Lucille to return just for one evening to speak at their mentorship night, she didn't hesitate. She smiled at the note tucked in the envelope, written in shaky cursive by one of the girls she used to tutor. "Miss Lucille, we still need your stories. Come tell us one more." She folded the paper, placed it on her nightstand, and without saying much to Shaq, began pressing her slacks and starching her blouse like she was preparing for the first day of school again. The event was simple. A panel of elders and educators were to speak to a group of high school students, most of them black, a few Latinx, some simply searching, about heritage, community, and resilience. Lucille had done it dozens of times before, but this one felt different. It was the first time she'd be standing at the podium without the official title. No more board affiliations. No more committee power. Just Lucille O'Neal, the woman. 2 days before the event, the message came like a cold gust. Event postponed, due to zoning code violation. The building had reportedly failed a surprise inspection. Something about emergency exit clearance and occupancy limits. The Youth Alliance director was stunned. They had hosted dozens of events like this one. Nothing had changed, except the presence of Lucille's name on the program. Word spread quietly at first, through Sunday whispers at the First Baptist, and side conversations in corner booths at Mervin's Diner. The center's doors stayed closed. No official explanation followed. But folks had lived in Elmsworth long enough to know that when you couldn't see the hand behind the curtain, it usually belonged to the same man pulling the strings. Shaq found out the next morning, sipping coffee with Lucille on the porch. "They canceled it?" he asked, his tone flat. She nodded once, not meeting his eyes. Said it was a fire code issue. A misunderstanding. "Do you believe that?" Lucille took another sip before answering. "I believe in patterns." Shaq didn't say anything after that. He didn't have to. The moment felt eerily familiar, like a page turned backward instead of forward. The same zoning board, Randall once chaired now, had new names, younger faces, but the scent of control hadn't left the room. He didn't need to make the call himself. All he had to do was plant the seed, let policy and red tape do what prejudice used to do out loud. But this time, something shifted. A few days later, Miss Thelma, who ran the corner thrift store, and once babysat half the neighborhood, kept her doors open an extra hour, just to let a group of teenagers hold a makeshift book club with folding chairs and borrowed copies of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. They called it Miss Lucille's Circle. 2 days after that, one of the young teachers at Elmsworth High moved his creative writing class outside, literally onto the sidewalk in front of the shuttered community center. He taped construction paper to the windows that read, "Voices can't be zoned out." At first, Lucille didn't say anything. She watched from her porch. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that comes with a knot in your stomach. Pride and pain dancing in the same breath. Shaq started noticing the shifts too. People he hadn't spoken to in years reached out. Old teammates, business folks, pastors, city workers. Not all of them asked for anything. Some just said they'd heard what happened. Some wanted to know the truth. Some already knew the truth, but wanted to be sure someone else did too. He sat in his car one evening, just outside the community center, watching as a group of kids chalked poems onto the sidewalk. One read, "They shut the door, but we still speak." Another simply said, "Lucille taught me." It was then Shaq realized something. This wasn't about one woman being silenced. It was about legacy, about an entire generation being told to forget who built the bridge they were now walking across. Randall's interference wasn't about zoning codes. It was about control, about cutting off influence at the root. But Elmsworth had changed, even if the faces in power hadn't, and Lucille's impact ran deeper than ordinances and bylaws. It had become a living memory, passed from child to child, from neighbor to neighbor, tucked into poems, handed down in lessons, stitched into the community quilt of resistance. Lucille finally spoke up a week later, not at a podium, but from her front lawn. She invited the youth group to her house. They brought chairs. Someone brought speakers. A local poet read under the stars. Lucille spoke last. Not long, not loud, just long enough to remind everyone that silence wasn't the same as defeat, that sometimes the most radical thing you could do was refuse to disappear. "I was told this was retirement," she said, her voice soft but unshaking. "But I reckon I don't know how to stop working when the work's not done." The crowd clapped, but it wasn't the kind of applause that came with fanfare. It was layered, deep, an acknowledgement, a thank you. And back on Hollow Bend, from the top window of a house too large for comfort, Randall Knox watched the flicker of lights from Lucille's yard. And though no headlines were written, no protests staged, something undeniable had begun. Not a revolt, a return, because some legacies don't retire. They rise. Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of his SUV and stood in front of Randall's house without speaking, without fidgeting, without looking back. He didn't carry a folder, didn't bring anyone with him, just a single envelope in his jacket pocket, and a presence that made the porch lights flicker even though the sun was high. He didn't ring the bell immediately. He stood there for a moment, hands at his sides, taking in the place, its symmetry, its sterility, its statement. The whole estate sat heavy with history, as though even the stones under the steps knew they weren't resting on honest ground.
Then came the knock.
3 deliberate strikes. Not loud, not aggressive, but absolute. The kind of knock that doesn't ask a question. It tells you someone's waiting. Randall took longer than necessary to open the door, though Shaq knew he was watching the entire time. When it finally creaked open, Randall stood in a crisp gray button-down and slacks like he was heading to a board meeting, not a reckoning. His smile tried to rise, but it stalled halfway, unsure whether this was business or confrontation. His hand gripped the edge of the doorframe a second too long. "Shaquille," he said, voice flat but trying to warm. "Didn't expect—" "I know," Shaq interrupted, calm and clear. "Mind if I come in?" Randall hesitated, then stepped aside. Of course. The inside of the house was everything the outside promised. Elegant, grand, cold. The furniture looked unused, the surfaces spotless. No photos of children, no warmth in the art. Just space and status. Shaq followed Randall into the den, where a fire flickered even though the room was already warm. Randall gestured to a leather chair. Shaq didn't sit. "I won't be long," he said, voice steady, like a stone skipping once across a lake and sinking without a splash. "I'm not here to argue. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you a story." Randall blinked, uncertain. "All right." Shaq took a breath, not because he needed one, but because he understood the weight of what came next. "My mother doesn't talk about herself much. She doesn't explain her strength, because she doesn't owe anyone an explanation. But I've watched it. Lived in it. I've seen her cook a meal for a man who called her colored help when she was 16. I've seen her forgive a police officer who put her face down on the pavement for walking home too late from work. And I've seen her hold back a room full of anger with just her calm. Randall shifted in his seat, unsure whether to respond. He didn't. She's carried more silence than you could measure. Not because she's afraid, but because she knows shouting doesn't always change hearts. Sometimes, it's presence. Sometimes, it's staying. Outliving the hate. Teaching through endurance. Shaq paused. Let the room breathe. I saw what you did at her retirement. The words, the smile. I've seen the zoning board's work. The permits. The center getting shut down. I see the moves. I know how power works in this town. And I know your hands aren't clean. Even if they never touch the mess direct. Randall opened his mouth. But Shaq lifted a hand. Not threatening, just final. This isn't a confrontation, Randall. This is clarity. I'm not here to make you feel guilty. Guilt is cheap. I'm here to give you something. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope. Inside was a copy of the letter. The one Chester Knox had written to Lucille. All those years ago. The one full of regret and honesty. Sealed in time and shame. Shaq placed it gently on the side table. Beside a framed certificate, Randall probably thought made him untouchable. I read your father's words, Shaq said. The parts of him he never showed you. The truth he tried to bury because your family didn't know what to do with a man who once loved someone he was supposed to hate. Randall didn't reach for the envelope. He just stared at it, jaw tightening, but eyes unblinking. I'm leaving this here, Shaq continued. Not to shame you, but to remind you that history has a way of circling back. Not to haunt, to heal, but only if you let it. The room fell into a quiet that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like held breath. Shaq turned to leave, but stopped at the doorway. You've spent your life controlling rooms like this. Controlling stories. Controlling people like my mother. But you can't control legacy. You can't control memory. And you damn sure can't control what people choose to remember when you're gone. Randall didn't speak. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Shaq walked to the door, opened it without help, and stepped back into the daylight. As he crossed the threshold, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. Inside the house, Randall remained still. The letter sat untouched on the table, but the weight of it filled the room. For the first time in years, Hollow Bend felt cold, not from the air, from the shift. And in that silence, something broke. Not loudly, but deep. The knock would echo longer than the words ever could. The strange thing about justice is that when it finally lands, it doesn't always sound like a gavel hitting wood. Sometimes, it's quieter than that. Sometimes, it moves through a town not with noise, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that follows a storm, not the kind that leaves debris, but the kind that leaves people looking at each other with new eyes. Randall Knox vanished quietly, just as Shaq had expected. 1 week after the knock on his door, his name slipped off the Elmsworth Planning Board's website without announcement. A few days later, a line in the town's online bulletin noted that he had resigned from the Historic Preservation Committee, citing personal reasons. No press release, no replacement lined up, just a few murmurs at lunch counters and barbershops. The kind of whispers that don't require confirmation because everybody already knows. He didn't show up to the Chamber of Commerce mixer, didn't sit on the church board's fundraiser committee. His house, the grand estate on Hollow Bend, stayed dark after sundown. Porch light off, curtains drawn, blinds shut so tight it looked like they were trying to keep history from seeping in. His absence wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate, as though the man himself understood that the room no longer tilted in his direction. And while his name faded, something else rose. The Elmsworth Community Center reopened 2 weeks later. The zoning citation was retracted, quietly buried beneath a clerical error, which in Elmsworth speak meant someone had been told to stand down. No apology was issued. None was expected, but the front doors were unlocked. The lights flickered back on, and the kids returned like water to dry soil. The youth program Lucille had been meant to speak at was rescheduled and renamed. They called it the Legacy Night. No one explained the change. They didn't have to. The name echoed down the halls, painted onto posters with bold, bright letters. This time, when Lucille walked through the doors, the room didn't just rise, it leaned in. She didn't say much. She never did when the air was already heavy with meaning. But when she stepped to the microphone, her voice was clear. Sometimes the storms don't come with thunder. Sometimes they come in the form of questions you never thought you'd ask. But if you wait long enough, if you listen hard enough, the answers always find their way home. There was no applause, just silence. The good kind. The kind that says we heard you. Shaq stood in the back, arms folded. He didn't need to speak. He hadn't spoken publicly through any of it. Not to reporters. Not to the local podcast guy who asked for a statement. He'd told them it was a family matter. And they believed him, because even those who didn't fully understand the tension in Elmsworth understood one thing. When Shaquille O'Neal says it's personal, you leave it there. But behind that stillness, things had shifted. The neighborhood around the center started gathering more often. Sunday breakfasts turned into impromptu strategy sessions. Retired men who used to sit in silence at the barbershop began comparing city ordinances, checking permit lists. High schoolers began asking about planning boards, internships, law. Something subtle had changed. Not loud, not overnight. But it was real. The people of Elmsworth had always known what power looked like. What they hadn't always known was that they could change it without burning it down. That sometimes, justice walked in, wearing a calm expression and size 22 shoes. Lucille began gardening again. That was how Shaq knew it was done. Her roses had withered during the weeks after the ceremony, petals curling like fists. Now she knelt in the dirt each morning, sleeves rolled, hat low, humming old gospel songs under her breath. She didn't talk about Randall, didn't ask about the letter, but she smiled the way she used to, the way she did before that retirement day, when the sun had betrayed them with its shine. One afternoon, while she was planting bulbs near the back fence, a boy rode up on a bike with a cardboard sign tucked under his arm. Lucille wiped her hands, raised a brow. "You look like you're up to something." The boy grinned. "Miss Lucille, can I hang this on your porch?" She motioned him forward. He unfolded the sign, scrawled in thick marker. "She taught us to stand tall, even when they tried to shrink us." Lucille didn't say anything for a long moment. Just nodded, eyes glassy. The boy hung it himself, crooked but proud. Then he rode off without asking for a thank you. He didn't need one. Shaq watched from the kitchen window. Smiled. The porch looked different now. Not fixed, but across town, no one said Randall's name aloud anymore. But people remembered. They remembered how he showed up, then vanished. How the power he thought he had dissolved, not through rage, but through memory, through truth handed down, like heirloom. And maybe that was the most fitting justice of all. Not the kind that came with headlines, but the kind that came with reverence. The kind that lived in glances, gestures, signs on porches, and stories passed across generations without needing ink. The silence after thunder wasn't empty. It was sacred. And in Elmsworth, it meant the storm had finally cleared. The morning light slipped through the windows of the Elmsworth Community Center, like a soft hymn, bathing the wooden floors and faded posters in gold. The building, once shuttered and nearly forgotten, now breathed with life again, humming with voices, echoing with laughter, walls dressed in bright artwork made by kids who knew more than they let on. The center had been renamed quietly, 2 weeks earlier. No ribbon cutting, no media coverage, just a bronze plaque placed near the front entrance that read, Lucille O'Neal Youth Enrichment Center. A place to grow, to remember, to rise. Inside, near the mural wall painted in bold hues of blues and oranges, a group of kids huddled in front of an old photo collage. It showed Lucille in different seasons of her life, reading to toddlers, marching with city teachers, standing beside stacks of books taller than she was. In the largest image, she stood in front of the very center they now played in. Hands folded, gaze steady, as though she could see what was coming long before it arrived. A small boy in a red hoodie, no more than 7, tugged at the sleeve of one of the older volunteers, a teenager named Darren, who had once nearly dropped out of school before Lucille took him aside and handed him a journal, saying, "You don't have to shout to be heard. Write your truth, and the right people will find it." The boy pointed at the biggest photo. "Who's she?" Darren didn't answer immediately. He looked at the image, then back at the boy, then past him to the empty chair near the reading nook, where Lucille used to sit every Wednesday morning for story time. She hadn't been gone long, only a few months. But time was strange in spaces like this. Some people left echoes. She left entire sentences. That, Darren said, his voice soft and sure, was Miss Lucille. She taught people how to fight without fists, how to carry fire in their chest without burning the place down. The boy blinked. Like a superhero. Darren smiled, crouching beside him. Something like that. But she didn't fly. She walked. Every day. With her back straight, and her voice low. She didn't yell. Didn't have to. People listened anyway. The boy nodded slowly. Eyes wide, as if he was beginning to grasp that not all heroes came with capes. Some wore loafers, and carried spiral notebooks. Some planted seeds in places no one else saw value. In the background, near the double doors leading to the back garden, a tall man in a dark coat walked by. He didn't stop or wave, just glanced once toward the photo wall, his gaze lingering a breath longer than anyone else's, before he nodded, barely perceptible, and moved on. It was Shaquille. No cameras, no entourage, just a son walking through the house his mother built, making sure the walls still stood the way she left them. He didn't visit often. He didn't need to. His presence was folded into the foundation now. Not because of fame, but because of what he chose to carry. Because when the time came, he didn't flex his strength. He honored her. Outside, the garden buzzed with life. Flowers bloomed where once the soil had gone dry. The Miss Lucille's circle still met every Thursday, kids sitting in a semicircle, reading essays, stories, and poems they weren't afraid to share anymore. There was no official leader, just a rotating seat, and a promise. You speak your truth, and we listen without interrupting. The words of Lucille lived in those circles, not as slogans, but as reminders that dignity wasn't loud, that forgiveness wasn't weakness, that silence could be strategy, and presence could be protest. Back inside, the boy in the red hoodie touched the edge of the photo, tracing the lines of Lucille's face with one small finger. Did she know my grandma? He asked, unprompted. Darren nodded. She knew everybody, especially the ones who thought nobody saw them. The boy thought about that for a long time. Legacy is a strange thing. It doesn't always settle where you expect. It doesn't rest in awards or buildings or headlines. It lives in the way people move after you've gone, in the questions they ask, in the stories they pass down, not because they're required to, but because they want to. In the years that followed, Elmsworth changed, not all at once, not in every corner, but enough. Enough that the zoning board held public meetings, now with community input. Enough that the local high school added a Black history course taught by a teacher who used to be one of Lucille's library aides. Enough that a little boy knew her name, without ever meeting her. And Shaq, well, he didn't speak of that time much. Not on interviews, not in his books. But those who paid attention noticed the subtle shifts. How he mentioned legacy more than winning. How he talked about endurance, like it was a badge. How he honored his mother not with speeches but with steady action. One afternoon, a journalist covering a local mentorship grant asked him quietly at a press event, "What made you want to fund a youth literacy program in such a small town?" Shaq didn't pause, just looked at her and said, "Because somebody did it for me, before anybody knew my name." That was all. No press kit, no hashtag, just memory. The story of Lucille O'Neal didn't end in a courtroom or a headline. It lived in porch swings and protest poems, in unshuttered doors and reclaimed spaces, in a boy asking who she was, and someone answering not with facts but with truth. And long after the thunder faded, the silence she left behind wasn't emptiness. It was echo. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it settle. Share it where silence used to live. Pass it on, like memory, not content, because some legacies aren't built for applause. They're built to be remembered, repeated, and respected. Let this one live through you.